This is the morning brief from the Economic Times.
Last week, the United States of America supported India's proposal to waive off trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, popularly called TRIPS, for the manufacturing of COVID-19 vaccines. But will global pharma companies, lobbying bodies, and other developed countries support this decision? Will they be okay to share their coffers and allow other companies in developing countries to make vaccines and other medicines to fight COVID? I'm Devina Sengupta and you are listening to the Morning Brief. To understand the impact of this TRIPS waiver on India, I talked to Murali Neelakantan, former Global General Counsel of Pharma Heavyweights, Cipla and Glenmark, and colleague Vikas Dandekar, editor for Pharma and Healthcare for ET Prime. Good morning, Murali and Vikas, and thank you for being with us on this podcast.
Hi, good morning, David.
Thank you for having us.
Murali, at the crux of this discussion is what are patents and IP rights? And here, what do they mean in the pharma world?
Patents grant exclusivity as regards inventions, which means that whoever invents something and gets a patent on it can deny everybody else from using that knowledge, using what is contained in the patent, effectively copying what has been invented and patented. Beyond patents, you have know-how, you have copyright, you have design, and you have trademarks. So there are other forms of IP other than patents. And the same principle applies, that you can deny others from using what the government has granted as an exclusivity or a monopoly by issuing patents, trademarks, copyrights.
Vikas, how will the waiver of intellectual property rights be the complete game changer for India and other developing nations in their fight against COVID-19?
Devina, this is an essential part of how well are we prepared to handle this pandemic. The day has come when patents or intellectual property will have to be much more widely understood, and to have a tight fist on knowledge and scientific know-how at a time when the world needs vaccines and drugs and therapeutics will probably be the most detrimental thing to have. So, even with so much of discussions that have been going on, it has not been very well recognized that many of the large multinational companies are still not very clear on parting with their knowledge or their scientific know-how. And it's unfortunate that this is still being seen in a very narrow way. So, say, for example, vaccines or therapeutics, tomorrow, if there is some breakthrough that happens in therapeutics, not just vaccines, will it be fine for a US or a European or even an Indian company to keep it so closely in a loop, which doesn't become accessible for the rest of the world?
Murali, the developed nations, we've seen US and EU opposed to the TRIPS waiver before as well. Why is it that the developed nations are not okay with their patents being shared with the world? Are they afraid that the generic pharma business across the world will make more money?
It's a zero-sum game here, Devina. If big pharma makes lots of money, then it will do it at the cost of generics. And that's true of every monopolist. So it is not an unusual behavior. What they are missing out is that the monopoly comes with these kind of protections. So unlike natural rights, like right to life, which you cannot, it's not a zero-sum game. I can be alive and you can be alive. My being alive doesn't take away from you being alive. In patents, it is a zero-sum game, which is I exploit, don't let you exploit. So I make all the money and I don't share any of that with you. What we have seen in the past is that when these monopolies are reduced in some way and the barriers come down, then we have more product in the market. We saw that with AIDS, and then more people can get access to it. But whereas if the patent is strictly enforced, then the price of that product can be, let's say, $1,000 a pill. And I will make, as an innovator, I'll make lots of money rather than making it $1 a pill and having a billion people use it. So it just makes sense for them to continue to want to have strong patent protection, not allow the exceptions, and make billions. And we've already seen that with the announcements from the vaccine manufacturers. Pfizer expects to make an obscene number of billions from the vaccine program.
People are very serious about the safety of vaccines. And so moving something that had never been done, moving a vaccine from, say, a J&J factory into a factory in India, that it's novel. It's only because of our grants and our expertise that can happen at all. The thing that's holding things back in this case is not intellectual property. There's not like some idle vaccine factory with regulatory approval that makes magically safe vaccines. You've got to do the trials on these things, and every manufacturing process has to be looked at in a very careful way.
That was Bill Gates, co-founder of Microsoft, in an exclusive interview with Sky News, raising concerns over the impact of TRIPS waiver on COVID vaccines. Vikas, big pharmas like Murali just mentioned, Pfizer, for instance, aims to make a lot of money from this. But even when you have people like Bill Gates opposed to a waiver, where is this hesitancy for them?
Yeah, that's a good question. And from the philanthropic side, it also surprises me why an organization like Bill Gates Foundation will ever oppose a situation like this, where it has a chance of making a wider access available for drugs and therapeutics. My feeling is that, whenever there is a multinational move coming on these situations, the one point that they keep making is about whether, parting with their intellectual property will give them enough support for doing future innovations. But there are many, many examples that show that, by expanding access, companies have actually gained. And that has been the strategy that has been adapted by Gilead, not just for remdesivir that they are doing right now. It has also worked in their favor for their hepatitis C product, sofosbuvir. So it has worked, provided, there are many such clauses where you use compulsory license only for domestic use. Today, if you look at low and middle income countries, many of the countries do not have the domestic capabilities to handle production of a vaccine. So instead of really expanding the scope of compulsory licensing that may include exports also, we are now looking at a point where many are actually opposing that kind of an idea. Within the industry also, it's amazing how Pfizer and Novavax have actually opposed to the idea of TRIPS waiver, as against Moderna, which has also been, in a similar situation. I mean, that's one company which has got only one vaccine product.
Because you mentioned compulsory licensing. For our listeners, compulsory licensing is when a government allows someone else to produce a patented product or process without the consent of the patent holder. Murali, if you could throw some light on how compulsory licensing is also playing out in the domestic circles, how it works even within the country, that although we are asking for TRIPS waiver from the global firms, are we following a similar demand even within the country?
It's a very good question, especially because today the Union of India is telling the Supreme Court that it doesn't intend to issue any compulsory licenses. This is hypocrisy at a different level. At the WTO, you're asking all countries to agree that there is an emergency and compulsory licenses should be issued. But the Union of India is telling the Supreme Court that really nothing is going to be achieved by issuing compulsory licenses. So it's quite shocking. The impact of issuing compulsory licenses in India could be significant. It is not just on the vaccine. On the vaccine itself, if we can license Covaxin freely, then we can increase production dramatically. But also the IP waivers go to raw materials, consumables, even equipment that is required to make vaccines and therapeutics. It's necessary to have these waivers to produce equipment. If you're looking at those kinds of equipment that are used in hospitals to help patients, then we can quickly ramp up production of those as well. So I find it quite shocking that the government of India will tell the Supreme Court that compulsory licenses are not necessary and it's not an appropriate time to issue it. But the story in the WTO is that we are in a dire emergency and we need compulsory licenses to be issued by all countries. I can't find a way of reconciling these two positions.
Murali, when I was studying on this TRIPS waiver, one thing which came into mind is it is going to be a long drawn process. US, for instance, has said it will back something called text-based negotiations. Now, when I looked up text-based negotiation, it meant exchanging texts with their preferred wording. Now, this clearly means that this is going to be a long drawn-out affair. Do we have so much of time for that right now?
There are two aspects to the WTO waiver proposals. One is at the international level, where a majority of the countries of the world have agreed with the South Africa-India proposal. The text is yet to be agreed, and I hope that it will be agreed when the WTO meets later this year in November and December. But what it tells us is what countries can do with their own legislations, which is issue compulsory licenses. There is an acknowledgement that we are in an emergency. The flexibilities that are available in TRIPS and pursuant to the Doha Declaration actually can be used. So even if the text is not agreed in the next few weeks, countries are confident that they will not face retaliation at the international trade level if they go ahead and issue these compulsory licenses. So I wouldn't get too stuck up with waiting for the text-based negotiations to end. That could take some time, but the signal is very clear to individual countries that there is an emergency, they can issue compulsory licenses, and they're well within what was expected in TRIPS and the Doha Declaration to do so.
Vikas, why the different stance by the government of India?
Yeah, that's probably what is being feared by global companies. Unfortunately, as Murali also said, it's very difficult to understand exactly what triggered the government decision to file that affidavit in Supreme Court. Look, if you look at the way the corporate strategies have gone, number one, after one compulsory license given in 2012, we haven't done any because of the tremendous backlash that came from the global community. Number two, companies have themselves started feeling that if you really are opposing patents and intellectual property, then probably your resources dry up, getting a lot of litigation around you. Secondly, how many products will be there ultimately to really go after in terms of a compulsory license? And then you always have this uncertainty of whether you will be able to win it or not, because the litigation may take time. So that probably is where a lot of opposition happens. And Indian companies have also drawn some kind of a cold feet in doing compulsory license applications. So the government itself is giving a kind of a cold shoulder, assuring global multinational companies that please, we do favor IP, and please do not go dry on making investment proposals in India, because US has been constantly putting this pressure that, the investment climate itself is a problem in India because they don't respect intellectual property.
Okay, but Murali, what does it take to get all 160 plus nations at a WTO to agree to waivers like this? There must have been tremendous lobbying that goes behind the scenes, right?
Of course there is. And I think the US move to support IP waivers is significant. That itself has taken a lot of effort. If you remember, we had a number of Nobel laureates, civil activists, health activists, a big chunk of the Democrat Party all write to Biden and tell him that this is important. So there has been a movement for this for many, many months now. On the other side, we're seeing the big pharma lobbyists, bio and pharma, who are opposed to this on the grounds that they will lose significant business. We will have counterfeit and junk products from the developing world. All of these excuses that were made 20 years ago during the AIDS crisis are being made again today. So that is the big barrier to getting this done very, very quickly. And those lobbies exist in the US and exist in most of the developing world. They are big funders of political parties, irrespective of what the ideology of the party is. And so they have significant influence at WTO. They have a significant influence in nations themselves, amongst the political parties and amongst the politicians. So that is the pressure that is resisting this proposition from going through. But I think that we've reached a point where it is very difficult for even these lobbies to be credible at the time of a pandemic, to use any of these excuses. It may have been reasonably plausible, I think, 20 years ago, and it failed then. To do it now during a pandemic is virtually impossible to defend.
I would hope that happens for all of us, especially India, because we are asking for a waiver. But even if we get a waiver, will it solve our vaccine shortage supply problem? Is a waiver sufficient right now?
That's a very good question. So by itself, say for example, if all conditions are met and a waiver does happen, what we hear from experts is that, it's not a small molecule and it kind of everything is available within India to manufacture it. It's a much more complex manufacturing process. So I was a little taken aback by Moderna CEO's Stephen Bansel's statement that, even if we do a waiver, it will not hit our revenues so much because the manufacturing process to have all the ingredients at one place itself will take a lot of time. With that premise, it becomes very difficult to understand whether by itself IP waiver will be sufficient to allow companies and get into action. And within 3, 4, 5 months, we will see copies of, let's say, for example, hypothetically, mRNA vaccine in India, which is exactly the replica of a Pfizer or a Moderna vaccine. Because if I understand it correctly, among all the spares or requirements that goes into vaccine manufacturing, I think someone was saying it takes about 100 parts to be sourced from different parts of the world to make a vaccine. So if we have all of these ingredients together, we probably will be able to see some kind of a ramp up in vaccine production. And I definitely doubt that. So IP waiver is a brilliant first step, and it will have repercussions for the future, for many, many years in the future, in case there is a pandemic or not. Because I feel, where MNCs are feeling a little edgy is, will this be interpreted as a precedence and the same clauses be used in any other medical emergency? And that's why they are a little, not letting the grip go. So I don't think by itself IP waiver can do that magic. But yes, it's a brilliant first step if it can work out.
Murali, what's your take on this?
Because I think the arguments that you made, which is that there is know-how, it's a biologic, it will not have an impact, all of those things are being told to the government. Mm-hmm. I have a different view, of course. I think that we can make several of these raw materials in India if there was no patent barrier, and we can actually increase production of these raw materials. We can increase vaccine production. Don't forget, this is not for the next few weeks. We're talking this year, next year, and perhaps the year after. So thinking that we will not get immediate vaccine production increases in 2021 is not a credible answer. If we had patent waivers, if we had the ability to force tech transfer, then I think that we could have possibility that we have higher production of vaccines, higher production of raw materials and consumables, and we will have excess capacity perhaps in 2022. And the pandemic is still going to be here in 2022. And the consequence of having excess production is we could export it to a lot of countries which even till 24, the way we are going, may not get the vaccine. So it is not just for India, it is for the rest of the world as well.
Thank you, Murali and Vikas, for breaking down the larger implications of the TRIPS waiver and pointing out the hurdles to get the nods and why even within the country, we need to open up the patents as well. Bottom line, if the world had gotten together and removed restrictions against AIDS medicines, then in case of COVID-19 as well, developed nations and pharma majors should put humanity before economics. I'm Devina Sengupta and you've been listening to The Morning Brief. This episode was edited by Nehal Chaliawala and coordinated by Bhavya Dilip Kumar. I hope you enjoyed listening to the episode. Do send in your feedback to themorningbrief@timesgroup.com and share the episode on your social media networks. The Morning Brief airs every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. Thank you for listening and have a nice day ahead.